I'm a pretty avid backpacker in the PNW. Sometimes I'll hike for days on end without seeing another person. I think it's exhilarating being completely alone. There's truly no feeling like it. You get used to it, but personally, I can never help but be on edge. The environment is completely serene and friendly, but there's a constant feeling in the back of your mind that you can't shake. Most of the time you'll be chugging along, comfortable in your mind, but when you stop for even a moment to fill up on water, you can't help but look over your shoulder. Now nothing bothers me much out in the woods. I've run into brown bears, had elk trample through campsites late at night and much more, but this one night was much different. I was going on a deep backwoods hike. It was in the late fall off season. It was pretty cold, but the snow hadn't quite started falling yet. In fact, I usually plan my trips around this way. The forest ranger I talked to when I organised my trip told me that I was the only hiker she knew of who would be up here at that time. I was using dispersed camping sites so far off the beaten path that they don't even have fire pits. This night it was around 5 or 6 miles from the trail into the area. I set up camp at a site about 100 yards away from a stream, close enough that a faint babble was audible. I'd lit a fire, cooked dinner, and read for a while and was settling down to go to sleep. I laid there listening for the sounds of the woods and just to settle down with the creek. Just as I was nodding off, I started to hear voices. Nothing distant, no clear words, but clearly a group of people having a good time, laughing, and probably telling stories around a campfire. Now a feeling of dread come over me. I thought, I shouldn't leave the tent. Now the fear engulfed me like I've never had it do so before. All of the hairs on my arms, legs, and back of my neck stood on end. I laid there in panic for a while, the voices carrying on laughing in the distance. After a while, they receded into the background. I still decided to not leave the tent. I was too afraid. Now the next morning, after a very short night's sleep, I searched the surrounding area and the path to the site. There were a few shoe prints that were faded and worn around the edges, too old to be from the group I'd heard. I tried to shrug it off as nerves, and maybe just the nervousness of it all had got the better of me. But I couldn't shake a certain tension. I made good time to the next site. Now, for the last day of the trip, I looked around a little more than usual. Still nobody to be seen. This site had no stream. It was dry camping, and it wasn't a blast, but if you've got enough water for cooking and drinking, it's alright. So it was a lot quieter, just the chirps of bugs and the wind rustling in the trees. I cooked my dinner and stayed up for a good while after dark, sitting on a log, looking at the stars and listening to the sounds of the forest. I was trying to hear the voices before the night started, but there was nothing. I then turned in for the day, stretching out and just laying there. I felt restless though, and it felt like I was laying there for hours. Finally, a calm come over me, but then it's back. No, it wasn't particularly scary what they were saying or threatening. Just like a group of maybe 20 people having a good time, barely audible above the background noise. This time I'm calm, and there seems to be like an internal dialogue in the back of my mind. Why not join them? Sounds like they're having fun. No, I'd rather stay here. No, really. This is entirely unconscious and goes on for a while. I've never experienced anything like this. I was worried that I'd lost it. After a while though, the noises eventually faded away into the night, and I felt that I was alone. The next day I packed as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. During the day, I was much more at ease, like I'd always been in the past. I was relieved when I got back to the car and started home. Now I told the story a few times, and every time that I recite it, a little feeling of dread arises like I felt on that night. I really had no reason to feel strongly about what happened, but I do. Now on this one occasion, I told my teacher, who's a Native American. He got quiet for a minute and then said that I ran into stick Indians. He said it was good that I didn't leave the tent. Stick Indians are evil and dangerous and prey on those who are vulnerable or alone. The look on his face was sober. He told me not to go back to that place again, and these spirits are extremely aggressive and attack at the slightest provocation. He was very scared that I got that close to them and didn't realise, but he knew that the fear I felt was real, and that it was good because it probably protected me. Now whenever this subject comes up, I feel true fear inside. As I write this thousands of miles from the site, my arms are still quaking. I'm in the army, and while training in Germany, our platoon was sitting on a screen line conducting an area reconnaissance mission. During the night, the guy on guard heard somebody bang 3 times on the left side of the Bradley. That doesn't make sense because you need another large metal object to make such a loud noise. Less than 5 seconds later, he heard the same 3 knocks again on the top of the turret. A few seconds pass, and a high-pitched tone comes through our headset with 3 knocks on the back door of the Bradley, along with somebody screaming, "Let me in, let me in." This wakes me and the other one up, and we go and open the door thinking it's somebody in our platoon who was trying to get in touch with us. Now there was only complete darkness. We waited about 30 seconds, geared up, checked a 50-meter semicircle around us, and found nothing. We get back inside and every single fault light in the turret is on with some blinking, and they never blink. The radios were completely dead. We restarted the turret and everything worked fine. I called over the net to see if anybody else was in our area, and nobody was. The next day we asked our OCs, who are essentially referees, and nobody thought anything happened that night. Shortly thereafter, we discovered an old tank half buried and rusted out near our position. I was camping in upstate New York for about 2 weeks after 2 prisoners escaped. This was a highly notifiable escape and was national news. My girlfriend and I had hiked and camped for 2 days before this. We were very comfortable and met a lot of awesome people, but everybody was on alert because of the escapees. Now we had settled in a remote area upstate in New York that nobody was around during night. So I was sound asleep that night at about 5:30 AM. Now I had started to wake but stayed in my state of sleep, laying there in the tent, not trying to wake up my girlfriend. I knew that I didn't want to wake up for another 2 hours or so. Now not long after I was slightly awoken, I heard rustling in the woods around our campsite. It started out as just a few rustles, which caught my attention, but nothing to be alarmed by. Maybe it's just animals. Suddenly, the rustles are right outside my tent and I'm really on edge. Before I could even tap my girlfriend, all hell breaks loose. The tent is slashed open with a knife while I'm watching. My heart almost went through my throat. Before I knew what was happening, I was being pile driven to the ground by men with guns. Thankfully I noticed in the seconds of panic that the men had police armour on. I started screaming out my name, address, social security number, everything. My girlfriend was even jumped on and forcefully subdued while she was sleeping. Now once everyone's adrenaline calmed down, we showed our IDs and proved that we were just camping. It turns out that we weren't even sleeping far away from where the escapees were spotted. This was easily the most scary moment of my life. About 10 years ago when I was in the Navy, we were 100 miles away from any land. It was about 3 or 4 AM off the coast of Peru. I was an electronics technician that worked in the radio station with the other guy, a radio man, and we just sat up there scanning on HF, UHF and VHF radio stations listening for drug runners. We then intercepted a UHF signal that played a short piano, followed by a haunting woman's voice saying the following numbers: 11, 9, 4, 6, etc. This went on for about a minute. Then it would repeat the same sentence, followed by more weird piano sounds. We recorded the transmission, wrote the numbers down, then informed the captain, and shortly after a message was sent off to the area commander about the strange message. The reply we received was, "Disregard." That creeped the hell out of me. I later found out that this is a numbers station, and while this is not entirely understood, it's likely a method of getting secret codes out to intelligence agents in the field. Either way, It's creepy as hell. Imagine intercepting that at 4 AM in the middle of nowhere, having no idea what it is or what it means. Now in short, in college I spent 1 month house sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. The nearest town was 22 miles away. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of somebody knocking loud and hard on the front door, and the dogs were going crazy. No way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs and went back to sleep. The next morning that I went down, there was a car in the driveway. The guy who owned the car was found dead several months later. Now here's everything I know and what I experienced that night. It was June 1987. I know it was 87 because it is a season after the Bill Buckner baseball disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned a place. It was in Essie, Idaho. I won't say exactly what town it is 22 miles from because they might still own it and I don't want them to get more weird things after this. Now it was a pretty big place. There was a lot of acreage. The guy who was a full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad had just went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for a month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there, free food, satellite TV, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. Now I'd never actually been west, so I took him up on it. It sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with the dogs, riding the horse, shooting. Now, it was completely uneventful except for one night. That night, after the knocking stopped and the dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because I knew that there were 2 German shepherds inside with me and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. Now I'd been drinking a little but not a drunk mess by any means. There were several neighbours that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking somebody just simply drove up the wrong way. The next morning I go down, there's a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was about 100 yards away from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anybody with that car model and make, and told him about what happened the night before. He didn't know anyone and he called the police directly. Now the police did show up and they asked me a few questions and walked around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked. The police had to tow it. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There were also tyre tracks going to the house but not from it. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing and to call the police if anything weird happened. I have no idea who the guy was at all. Don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing or who reported him that way. He was just gone and my girlfriend's dad didn't know too much. After 1 month I went back home. My girlfriend and I broke up shortly after. I saw her out on town several months later. I asked her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead by suicide 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after he killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found, who found him, etc., and I got nothing. I never saw her again after. When I was 15, I was at a Boy Scout camp in Illinois. My tent mate was sick, so he went home on Tuesday. So Wednesday night, I was alone in my tent when I heard thuds, between 10 and 12 a minute. I thought little of it and went back to sleep. Tuesday night, alone again. I needed to go to the bathroom at about 1 AM. So I make it to the latrine, and behind me, I started hearing thuds, like somebody's chopping wood with a troop's axe at 1 in the morning. Someone who then stops, looks directly at me, then walks away into the woods. Now I've never been so scared in my life. Now as they turned to go away from me, they began laughing. Not only that, I heard more laughing later that night. I reported it to the camp staff and they did an investigation, which revealed that others had heard what I had and even seen the same thing. To this day, 5 years later, Nobody knows anything about this person, what they were doing, or why they were out there. It was confirmed to be not a camper or staff member. That's literally all that's known about it. I lived on a compound by myself. I know it sounds odd, but it's really my tiny home, workshop and a couple of other buildings for food and storage equipment and a guest room all rolled into one. Now during one really bad snowstorm, my area OOC was knocked out, so I decided to hunker in for the long haul. I spent almost 2 weeks without leaving there. 3 days in, I get woken up to a knock at the door. I get up to answer it, and halfway there, I realise the only way that this guy could knock on my door is if he broke the lock. So I grab my shotgun, ask him through the door who he is and what he wants. The guy says nothing and keeps on banging. I go to the back door and sneak around and see who it is. I then see a man lying on the ground, covered in blood, and shouting quietly for help. It turns out that he was driving, crashed, and dragged himself 5 miles down the road until he come upon my place. By then, he realised that I forgot to lock the bottom part of the gate and wrestled in. Luckily, he survived. I lived in Germany for many years while my father was stationed there. He was in the US Army. We lived off base in private housing and I loved it. It was amazing where we stayed. Now I quickly become really good friends with some of the local boys whose parents owned the town's dairy farm. We were always in the forest running around exploring, fishing, playing army, etc. I was only around 9 at the time. I'm 37 now. So one night, I stayed late at the farm hanging with the guys. We left at about 9 or 10ish. It was dark, but the moonlight gave me pretty good night vision as I remember it. I lived just across a soccer field and on a small cornfield from the farm. As I'm walking across the soccer field, I see a bit of movement ahead of me, just real quick from the corner of my eye along the tree line at the edge of the field. I quickly step up my pace. I turn to take my usual path through the cornfield to my house. I see at least half a dozen silhouette figures emerging from each side of the rows of corn on each side of the path. I froze so hard, I just stand there. Then, there's one behind me. Before I can snap around and haul ass, he asks in German where I was going. I then quickly turn around, and what I see surprises me, but also relieves me. I answered in English and told him that I was heading home. He was curious about my English. Now, it turns out that he was a team of special forces. I mean, these guys were decked out in so much tactical gear. They had night vision goggles, packs, bags, weapons. There was even a dog, and the dog wasn't barking like it was really well trained. Now, they were using these small towns off of bases to do some training or something. It just happened upon that this particular night, I saw them. I don't know why they chose to break cover and show themselves. I'm just thankful that they weren't too angry at me, and it wasn't anyone else who greeted me in the dark. My father-in-law used to live in rural Australia, about an hour from the closest town in a little valley with 3 other houses. Through winter time, he was the only house that was occupied. My daughter and I would visit quite often and stay over the weekends, or at least look after the place for the dogs if he had to go away. Aside from the usual snakes and giant lizards, the dogs wouldn't normally bark unless somebody was on the property. Now I woke up alone one night, in the dead of winter, and all 4 of the dogs were going mad and circling the house. I figured it was just something on the property, like an animal, and they would go out to chase it. I then walked out onto the deck and looked down onto the enclosed yard, just in time to see the dogs run around the corner of the house at the fence line. No big deal, they're probably chasing an animal away. I leaned on the railing of the fence just to make sure and wait for them to come back again. I'll point out that the fence is made of thick log posts, with one log across on top of the other and the empty spaces covered with chicken wire. So I'm up there watching the opposite corner of the fence for the dog's next pass, as I can hear them coming, and most of that side is obscured by trees and light bushes. Now whatever they were chasing, it was not an animal. It was too big. It looked like a person on all fours. Now long is the only word I can use to describe it. It was running along the top of the fence, panting like the dogs were. Now these dogs were pretty quick and actually quite smart. I've watched them repeatedly take down animals that got too close to us before. But whatever this thing was, it was quicker than the dogs were. Now I don't know why, but I was terrified. I couldn't move away or stop watching it. Now the dogs kept on following it, passing the fence again, until it eventually jumped off the fence onto the opposite side from where the dogs were, into the open paddock, and it just squatted there looking. At first it was just staring at the dogs, but then it tilted its head up and looked to where I was standing. It wasn't light enough to see its face, just that its head had moved. Once it saw me, it bolted off into the trees, still on all fours and faster than a person could move, especially in that position. I brought in all of the dogs after that, and they slept with me for the night, but I don't know, it was terrifying. This took place during the summer of '93. I was living in Montana, but had a boyfriend in British Columbia. I often travelled between the two places. We were broke and careless, so we hitchhiked when we needed to get somewhere further than biking distance. I had spent the month of August with him in BC, and eventually it was time to go back to school. I, of course, not having worked much all summer, had no money. My bum-ass boyfriend couldn't come through with the money either, even for a bus ticket. My parents were mad at me, so they won't give me any money. All my friends were broke, but we didn't have cell phones to call them anyway. Now we were living in a 2-room cabin with no running water in the mountains. The only phone was a party line that belonged to the neighbours that was basically only there for emergencies. The decision was made. I was already 2 days late for school, and I didn't feel like panhandling for a bus ticket. I had to get back and couldn't wait for my boyfriend's money to materialise. I would be doing my hitchhiking alone. I then filled up my backpack with all the stuff I needed, making sure I had my ID, because one time we hitchhiked to the border, left Canada, tried to get into the US before I realised that I left my ID in Canada, meaning I had no ID to enter the US. I also had no ID to get back into Canada, but that's a story for another day. Things went surprisingly smoothly for the majority of the trip. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got off the mountain and took me into town, all the way to Cranston, right near the border crossing. I walked across and was picked up almost immediately by a guy who gave me the first creepy vibes. But all he did was lecture me about how dangerous it is to hike alone, and how much I reminded him of his daughter. He taught me way to Kua, DNA ID, which is nearly half of the trip. I was having phenomenal luck, to be honest. I then walked outside to the city limits and stuck my thumb out. 1 hour went by, then 2. You'd often walk really slowly when you're trying to catch a ride, and eventually I come across a small flap of cardboard. I picked it up thinking that I could walk off at the next exit, borrow a marker at a gas station, make a sign, and maybe that's going to help me. So I'm walking along a little faster now, and suddenly I see something moving in my peripheral vision. I tense, look and see it's a 2-foot thin, dark snake trying to get over the cement guardrail. Now he was never going to make it over. He was kind of trying to throw himself over it sideways. I happen to like snakes, and he looked pretty harmless. I then used my sign as a shovel to throw him over. I now realise in hindsight that this was a bad omen. Before I could reach the next car, a car slowed down to a stop. It's always creepy when a car stops and you're walking up to it trying to judge if it's Ted Bundy or just someone eccentric like you. My heart always sunk a little. I knew it would just be a single man, but I soon realised that he wasn't alone. There was a kid in the front seat who looked about 10 or 13. The guy was a little too friendly, but what are you gonna do? Murder me in front of the kid? I decided to get in. Now it turned out that the man was pretty chatty, introducing the kid as his nephew. He said they were driving back from where they lived in St. Louis from visiting his brother in Seattle so the kid could visit his grandma. Now the kid never said a word. If I remember correctly, it being a very long time ago, it was about 3 hours to where I lived from Coeur He was taking Highway 90 right over the city I lived in, so I was relieved that I wouldn't have to get out of the car and thumb it again. The first hour goes by, and it's a friendly chit-chat, lots of family anecdotes and generally small talk. The switchblade my boyfriend gave me was cradled in the bottom of my palm the whole time, up my sleeve out of view, though I did begin to tense up a little bit. Now he kept up the friendly chatter, but eventually the questions he was asking took a racier turn, like do I have a boyfriend, what was he like, and other weird stuff. I silently panicked. This guy is a creep after all. The questions were getting more and more weird. My instinct was to play along with the conversation while I figured out what to do. I was pretty sure the drink he had in the console had more than pop in it. Basically, you could see him physically getting looser at the wheel as he went on. He kept asking gross questions. I was embarrassed for his nephew, but played along. I just kept on breathing deeply to try and not have a panic attack. Eventually, he made it clear that he expected some favours from me for the ride. At this point, we're about 20 minutes away from where I lived. I had to keep going along with it. Now, I put on my best come-highter smile and said to him, you know what, I bet she's home now. Let's go straight over to her place and we can get this started, talking about one of my friend's apartments. Now, I had him get off at my exit and asked him if we could get some beer for our first date. Now in Montana, you can buy beer at gas stations, so I had him stop at a place a few blocks from where I lived. When I somewhat reluctantly went inside to buy a beer, which I knew was in the back of the store, as I opened my door, I literally sprinted straight down an alley and around a block and dove into a huge clump of bushes, folding myself up as tightly as possible. I still had my knife, but I know it was out of my sleeve now. I was shaking, my heart was pounding like it's going to explode. I tucked my head into my knees and waited, listening for his car coming down the alley. When we got to the gas station, it was about 4 PM in September. There was plenty of light out. I stayed in those bushes until night fell and then finally sprinted home. I never heard his car come down the alley again. I could hear him yelling for me. He sounded pissed. I got to my front door, locked the deadbolt and collapsed. Dirt and little leaves all over me. It was the most terrifying thing that's happened to me. I never hitchhiked again after. I live in an old little place in Appalachia that was supposedly carved out of the mountains by a meteor. There is a 360-degree view of mountains around me at all times. Well, when I was in middle school, I got really into mountain biking. So because of my age, and my mum not wanting me to be on some random mountain path that nobody had went on for months, she wouldn't let me go deep into any trail. She would only let me go deep on the trail when I had a guy with me who owned a bike shop, who is also a co-worker as she was a teacher. Well, it had been months since I'd started doing weekly rides with this guy Joe, and a few other guys he rode up with. We went to this place called Lake Hill, as it was the road to the city's water supply, which had a lake-sized natural spring. Now one day, we had been riding for hours, like daybreak to probably an hour before dark. We just got to the point where we were going to turn around when we crest this hill and bam, there's a dude there, just standing there, wearing camo gear, a yellow raincoat in the middle of summer, standing about 15 feet away from our four-wheeler. He has a shotgun in his hand. Now Joe, who was the most athletic out of all of us, was in front of me, and I think I'd gotten behind him where the two younger guys were behind too. When you're pedaling a mountain bike up a steepish hill, you're not really looking forward, you're looking down at the ground. You're studying where your wheel is going to make sure you don't hit anything that's going to make you lose your momentum. So as it happened, I ran into the back of Joe and I was kind of annoyed. I looked up sharply and saw Joe position himself between me and the dude. The man said nothing, not a single word, not a word of comfort or compassion, despite the fact that he had just run up on us with a shotgun. Now, you don't see strangers anywhere in deserted places like this. Now, I've played these events through my head countless times, and this is what I think was happening. The guy probably thought, these guys have run up on me harvesting my pot. What if they tell the cops? Can I afford to take the chance? I don't know, there's a few of them. Wow, there's a kid too. Now, because I could see an edge of tension bleed out of his face when he looked at me, I swear it was him deciding to kill Joe, then deciding not to kill me. Now, Joe, to his credit, positioned himself between the man and me the whole time. Eventually, the guy just hopped on his four-wheeler, covered in plants, and rode away. I'll never forget the taste of exhaustion and adrenaline as we come off that hill. Now, luckily, I never saw him again since, and I still get that same sense of adrenaline just recounting that story like now. I spent 3 months in northwestern Utah in 1999 doing graduate field work. I was alone for almost all of it. I read Lord of the Rings, played guitars, laid in the dirt staring up at the stars. It was all very fun. Anyhow, one night I was sleeping, I heard strange noises. At around 3 AM, it jolted me awake instantly. I was in a tent and about 30 feet away from me, I heard a really loud grunt that lasted for about 4 seconds. Maybe it was an animal clearing its throat, I thought. Most alarmingly though, it definitely had an aggressive tone to it. It sounded like a challenge. There were no bears in that area, but mountain lions were possible, although very rare. Now, I sat upright straight away and grabbed my flashlight. I had no weapons with me other than a small knife that was used for the cooking gear. I waited, quiet as a mouse, for about 30 seconds, listening for any noise at all. It was dead quiet. I dreaded it. I couldn't hear anything, but never said a single word. As quietly as I could, but it sounded like when you're opening a bag of chips and you're trying not to make any sound. I positioned myself at the zipper of the tent, then suddenly yanked it open with a flashlight. Nothing. Then I bolted for the truck about 50 yards away. I made it and looked around with the flashlight. Still nothing. I figured that it was out there watching me, unless it ran away when I entered the truck. Now, I had the window crack a bit and watched and listened for about an hour. I heard nothing. I lay back in the seat and tried to sleep, but it was actually quite chilly and I was only wearing some light clothing. Now, the next morning, I looked for tracks and again saw nothing. For the next 6 or so weeks, I slept in the back of the truck. Now, the sound I heard was similar to that of a cougar, but I'm still not sure what it was to this day.